when for the first time I got associated with HBCR, Humanitarian Policy and Conflict Research, where Claude, who is now at the President's staff of ICRC, was working at the time. I have come back to the place because I appreciate a lot the academic, methodological beef up of operational activities in which we are engaged. And I have been engaged in diplomacy of a country and now in an organization which deals with law policy and operations on humanitarian level, and it's a great opportunity also to see a very good old friend Jennifer back here at Harvard. We go back to the last century. So I really appreciate the opportunity to say a few things on migration here. I look even more forward to the discussion afterwards. But let me just start with Gregor's believe it or not introduction that you made beforehand. Indeed, one of the signs, just to illustrate how on top of the reality he was in his introduction, is that today ICRC has the largest operation in the Middle East, where conflict seemed unthinkable a couple of years ago. It's 1/3 of everything we do in the world. We do in Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, and Yemen. So 5 countries make up to 35% of all budget activities of ICRC. Just I wouldn't have thought 6 years ago that this would be the reality. Secondly, it strikes me that while we thought, when I started in 2012, I thought, and I had the sort of ambition at ICRC to thin out as much as I could any operations still left in Europe, because this was basically the place where you had to cut, if you had to cut. And so we basically, my ambition was starting, I said, well, let's bring everybody down from Europe and send it to the Middle East where conflict started, and to Africa where we had conflict dynamics. And we have our 6th largest operation worldwide now on the European continent, in Ukraine, where ICRC is amongst the only, if not the only, international organization still with an access to the Donbass and a huge program in the Donbass. We wouldn't have thought. And 4 weeks ago I was in Greece visiting to see what ICRC, which is not a migration agency and works close to conflict, in conflict, and less with the larger consequences of conflict, was discussing with the Greek Prime Minister on opening an office in Athens, the first office in the European Union, which would have an operational dimension. So indeed, just to illustrate that, believe it or not, we are where we are at the present moment. It's good to be at Harvard and to talk about migration, because a multicultural crossroads of people like this one is a good reminder of what science has brought to migration policy for quite some time, and we know it, that the positive impact on migration on societies, on academic research, on age structure in society, on innovation, on economic development of a society. We all know that there are downsides of migration as well. We know about the dangers, the exploitations, the traffickers, the intercultural difficulties, the integration problems. We have done research on all those issues, but by and large, science says, and is quite in agreement, as much as I perceive, that migration is positive for societies. And what is troubling is that body politics articulate their views in a very different way. Body politics in Europe tell to European politicians that migration is not what the European societies want. And this is deeply troubling and has troubled me now for decades. That while all the economic, scientific, societal indicators on balance come to positive results, the political articulation once a society is confronted with migration is rarely a positive one. There are positive examples as well, but to discuss maybe a little bit later what makes the experience positive and what makes it less positive. Let me also, in the light of what happens in Europe, maybe just remind us of one or two figures. It's always good to keep dimensions when we talk about migration. The so-called mass migration or migration crisis in Europe looks very strange to a president of the ICRC. We are working in the most stark and difficult conflicts of the world. In 50 armed conflicts, we have our core operations, and our main customers and beneficiaries are displaced people by violence. And most of those displaced today in the world are internally displaced people who live still in the place where the conflict takes place. Out of 60 to 70 million displaced by violence today, 45 million are internally displaced, and they live in the country where the conflict is taking place. I always say only 4 million Syrians are abroad. 8 million Syrians are displaced internally. Most of the humanitarian problems that we are facing with internally displaced people who flee conflict and violence, but they flee in the neighborhood. And why do they do that? Because they keep hope up that as soon as the conflict is over, they want to restart their lives as close as possible to where they come from. People do not migrate for no reason. Most of the people want to stay where they are. And so most of the problems are where people stay. And the big humanitarian response on which we are challenged today is how do we scale operations in the numbers of conflicts with all those internally displaced persons who have no legal status as refugees. So out of 60 million, 45 million are internally displaced, 15 million are refugees, 10 million are stateless people in the world. And these figures can be contested, but by and large it's the ones everybody is used to use. If we look at the 15 million refugees, those who left the country have crossed the border, most of them live in neighboring countries of where the conflicts take place. Those countries who are recipients of refugees are neighboring countries of conflicts. First, Iran, suffering from the conflict in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So they get the largest number. You have Ethiopia in Africa, the largest country with the largest refugee population on the African continent. It's squeezed in between Sudan and Somalia. So they get the refugees from both of the country. Those who are in despair of being displaced internally and they flee to the neighboring countries. It's the Lake Chad region, which has a lot of refugees because of the violence of the Boko Haram. It's the Horn of Africa, it's Afghanistan, Pakistan, and it's always the neighboring countries which are those who are most exposed to people displaced by violence. So I think it is important in the whole discussion that we keep proportions. It's not only a subjective feeling of people like us who think that it is only marginal what comes to Europe. It's also objectively, if we look at the proportions, not the big numbers ending up in Europe. Maybe another point I wanted to make in this introduction is that we have an enormous confusion of terms and terminologies in this discussion. We always discuss migration. And migration and migrant and refugee and displaced by violence and legal and illegal and voluntary and involuntary and all those terms are used somehow indiscriminately and in a not a very sharp way with regard to what we are talking about. So nobody really knows what the migration crisis is. There are 250 million people living outside their homes, their national homes today. But most of them are living happily where they are, and they are contributing to the economies and societies in the countries where they live. So there is not really a migration crisis with which we are confronted at the present moment. We have a crisis of people who suffer because they are displaced by violence in their country, in their own country, in the neighboring country, and along migration route. Let me maybe make another point here in the introduction. There is a lot said in the European discussions today that migration levels haven't been seen, and the dimension of the migration level haven't been seen in decades, and that this is putting an enormous pressure putting European societies under enormous pressure. But here again, let us not forget the numbers of people who moved in Europe during the Hungarian uprising of 1956 and the Czechoslovak uprising of 1968 were much bigger than today's migration crisis. 3 times more in the case of Hungary, twice more in the case of Czechoslovakia. So, and this has been decades ago. And Europe in the meantime has been exposed to all sorts of population movement, migration movement, refugee movements, and has become a different society. So something is strange with the terms and terminologies and assessments that we are finding continuously in the so-called migration debate and the number debate. These are not big numbers. It's not that technically it would be impossible to integrate 1 million people on the European continent. Let's face it. There are 30 million tourists going to Greece every year. And these tourists find houses. Of course they pay for houses, but I mean, when somebody wants to tell me that it is physically impossible to find shelter for people who need shelter in a country of the European Union, I have a slight problems with the dimension. What strikes me in the political debate in the European Union is the amount of panic and rhetoric of panic which has come to political leaders. I would expect political leaders to follow the basis. That's what political leaders do. But I'm surprised to see the amount of panic rhetoric which has come to the European debate. Don't come to Europe. I mean, when you look at the quotes, do not believe the smugglers, do not risk your lives and your money. It is all for nothing. Greece or any other European country will no longer be a transit country. They can't host you. These are words from responsible political leaders in Europe. And it's disconcerting to see that a population movement leads to a panic reaction. We know about the reasons. Of course there are security problems with the migration movement. Of course this is not to take lightly. Of course there are problems to accommodate, to integrate, and to bridge the gap between those people who need protection and the integration capacities of the economies and societies in Europe. But this is a gap which needs to be managed, needs to be attended, and it's not the first time that a continent is confronted with this kind of problems. Let me emphasize once again, from where we look at from ICRC side at the European so-called migration crisis, there are good reasons for people to move. I just come back from Afghanistan and from Syria, where I have spent the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, one in Afghanistan and one in Syria. And you put any European citizen or European politician to Homs or to Mazar al-Sharif and Jalalabad, and it's obvious that people flee for a reason. It's not because they think that this is an El Dorado, it's not because they have a nice life where they are. Cities in Syria are destroyed and unlivable to a large extent. And they don't find their homes, and they don't find any homes near the cities, and they don't find any homes more in the neighboring countries. And so population movement happen for a reason. Conflicts are still ongoing, and the reception structure and the ability of humanitarian actors to stabilize lives and livelihoods of Syrians and Afghans is limited. Of course, the Afghanis are in a better position today because their country is less destroyed and less affected than the Syrians are. But even there, it's not the poorest either of the Afghans and the Syrians leaving. The poorest stay where they are or go to the neighboring countries. But it's those who have been very often politically active, who have exposed themselves, who move further on, come to Europe and put some pressure on the European system to receive those migrants. In the light of what has happened, and given where we are as a frontline responder to humanitarian crises and violence and conflict, we have carefully looked in what a strategy is to respond to those population movement. And the first and foremost response for an organization like ICRC is to try to scale our operations in the countries of origin. It is to scale up our operations in Syria, in Afghanistan, and to try to stabilize people where they are. This is the whole importance of humanitarian work, and to make a life and livelihoods possible for people in Syria. Here again, it's not impossible. If international humanitarian law would be respected, at least in any satisfactory level, in a conflict like Syria, we would be able to help and to stabilize much more of the Syrians in Syria itself. If they wouldn't need to flee, if there would be a reasonable amount of respect for neutral and impartial humanitarian actors. So we continue to believe that one of the most efficient and effective responses to the migration movement and the movement of population by violence is to stabilize societies and to help people where they are at the present moment to respond to basic needs and social services. The second thing we have done is, together with the Red Cross and Red Crescent organizations in the neighboring countries, is to scale the operations in the neighboring countries. This is doable, it's easier, but here again, the reception capacities of neighboring countries contrary to other parts of the world, is coming to a difficult point. Social services in Lebanon, in Jordan, are difficult to entertain. So scaling the operation in neighboring country, that's what we have done over the last 2 years. No other operation has grown so much as our operations in Jordan and in Lebanon. So it's important to scale those operations. And thirdly, what we are trying to do is to build networks of responses and humanitarian responses along migration routes in order to mitigate some of the negative effects of those who are displaced, giving them food, shelter, water, medicine, respond to their basic needs, and ensure that at least those basic needs are addressed on the migration routes. So let me just summarize up to that point. I think we see that the drivers of displacement by force are important at the present moment. We have never seen since the Second World War the amount of crises and conflicts and displacements that we see today. But those ending up in Europe are only a small fragment of those who are really displaced. For those small fragments, there are possible solutions, even if we have to recognize that there is a difficulty in managing the expectations to be protected and the integration capacities of European societies. And there are strategies to cope in the countries, in the neighboring countries, along the migration routes, with some of those stark problems with which we are confronted today. If we look at more practical solutions, what are more practical solutions? I must say, I have been impressed that whether in Syria or Afghanistan, when you ask people who are displaced what they want, they have a very clear ambition. And it's a program which is summarized in 3 points. They always tell you the same. It's jobs for us, education for kids, and security for communities. And I think as long as you can, and as long as we can, this is the best program in order to cope and to mitigate some of the negative impacts of the crisis which is unfolding. I think we need a new compact in order to deal with such a program, in order to address not issues either in Europe, in the neighboring countries, or in countries of origin, but to look at the migration issues in much a more comprehensive way. One of the issues that we are confronted today is clearly that political decision-making is taking place in organizations which are limited and not in sync with the migration routes. So you never have a comprehensive approach to migration routes where one response is following the other response. You have the humanitarians dealing with Syria. You have others dealing with the neighboring countries, and you have the Europeans sitting together and wondering what they should do with 1 million refugees. This is simply not politics which are in sync with the problem, but the structures are somehow not tuned to finding solutions to a complex flow of people moving in different directions. I think we need a change of mindset. Figures may be one thing, but also the continuous focus of what is not working is a problem. There is a lot of things which are working, a lot of job creation programs which are positive, a lot of educational programs for refugees which are working and can be scaled. So I think it is important here again that we inject a new type of confidence into solving some of the problems coming out of population movement. And we just do not stand there in just analyzing the problems and declaring that a solution is not possible. I think it is important to go back to some reasonable understanding of shared duty to address this problem. I think Gregor has mentioned it in its introduction. It is unacceptable that certain countries just declare that they are not part of the solution. Because not being part of the solution is being part of the problem. And I think we are within Europe and globally in a situation where there is no reasonable political discussion on duty sharing and accommodating and investing in bringing some solution. I think we need some innovative approaches. I think engaging with the private sector has shown in Germany that some of those innovative approaches are possible. If you engage with the private sector, they are ready to create jobs for special occasions and to contribute to solutions. I think, again, educational programs have proven interesting. I think legislative programs which somehow try to time and sequence the moment when migrants, refugees come to the labor market in an intelligent way are good approaches to look at legislation and try to mitigate the competition effect, which again has political negative repercussions. So my point here is only solutions are available. They are even pilot projected. They are even working, but they are not scaled at the present moment because there is a lack of political will to scale them, to discuss them, to invest into the problem part of the migration movement. As a humanitarian organization, of course, I'm always asked, what is the humanitarian angle you are taking to the decisions that you have seen coming out of the European Union at the present moment? And of course, we are worried to see one of the staunchest supporters of international humanitarian law suddenly going into agreements which at least put questions on whether international humanitarian law at large, refugee law in terms of non-refoulement, in terms of opening options for refugees, third country solutions, that this organization is somehow opening doubts on their willingness to take international obligations seriously. We have been cautious for good reasons to go to accusations that we see violations of international humanitarian law in the EU-Turkey deal. A lot depends on how you make this deal happen. And it's encouraging that at least in terms of political declaration, many European Union leaders have said this is a deal which needs to be implemented according to the law. But of course, this needs implementation legislation, practice, procedures which are according to the law. A lot will depend on how European Union border police forces, NATO ships in the Aegeus, how they will confront the migration flow which comes. We are interested to know about the standard operation procedures put in place and whether those who are picked up in the sea are picked up and how they are treated and what their options are and what the procedures under which they are and what the legislative framework is which opens some options to them. Of course we are, as a humanitarian organization, concerned when we see more and more migrants going into detention, into migrant detention. It has always been our approach that migrants, because of being migrants, shouldn't be detained, that to the utmost alternative procedures have to be found. So we are concerned to see that increasingly in European countries migrants disappear in detention. And here again we are as humanitarians in front of a difficult dilemma. Should we contribute, visit those detention facilities in order to contribute to make more humane treatment, to ensure more humane treatment in migration facilities, or should we not? As humanitarians, we tend to be pragmatic. If people are detained, we are not asking whether they are detained for good reason. We are trying to ensure that we mitigate the problem of those being detained, and we ensure and we improve conditions of detention. But it's a delicate balance and a delicate dilemma in which humanitarians find themselves today. We are concerned about the use of force in border policing and public security when talking about migration issues. Are all the police forces and the military forces which are now drawn upon in order to ensure public safety and public security, are they trained to cope with the specific issues of migrants protesting? It's a very bad picture when I see as a European, when I see at the border of Macedonia and Greece, European border police and riot police tear gassing migrants. Not what you would expect to happen in such a situation. So my point here, just to conclude, is that while as ICRC and humanitarian organization, we are concerned on the respect of international humanitarian law and refugee law in the implementation of some of the deals which have been taken over the last, decided upon over the last couple of weeks. At the same time, we are pragmatic in trying to find and to encourage solutions and to support pragmatic solutions. But we can't just discard that refugee law is the law and it has to be implemented as good as ever we can wherever we are confronted with the dilemma. So being it in detention, in procedures of reception, in procedures of asylum on the European continent, in the implementation of non-refoulement, in the use of force with regard to the migration movement, these are important concerns that we have as humanitarian organization and on which we intend to engage and we want to engage with the European countries. Once again, I mentioned proportions at the beginning of my few introductory remarks. Our activities on the European continent will remain marginal because we think that our core activity is where most problems are with displacement by force and violence, and those problems are not on the European continent. What is a problem is the example character of the European Union, which forces us to deal with the issues and entices us to engage with European countries and with the European Union, so that international humanitarian law and refugee law and procedures are respected on the continent as scrupulously as the European Union would like it then to be respected in other parts of the world. If there is one problem with prejudices at the present moment, is that